Caribbean is a relatively small part of the world, but the events that have taken place in the Caribbean, whether that's the European encounter with Indigenous peoples, the histories of colonialism and slavery more broadly, the histories of capitalism and how much that was entangled with the project of colonialism, have had an enormous role to play in our global understanding of the world. The Caribbean is arguably a kind of crucible for globalization. It is the origins of where we can understand and see the roots of contemporary modern society. So much of what happened in the Caribbean infiltrated and impacted Britain as well. The British Empire was not a kind of far-flung entity. It actually really shaped the ways in which Britain operated economically, politically, socially, and culturally. And throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th, and even arguably still today, we see the ways in which these histories, this entanglement still plays out on the racial and class disparities that we see between Black Britons and white Britons, and in particular between African Caribbean people and others. The encounter that Europeans had with Indigenous people in the Caribbean is really what starts this entangled relationship. Oftentimes, Indigenous people in the Caribbean were depicted as backward, as in need of tutelage, as kind of ripe for Christian conversion, when in fact they had their own societies, they had their own ways of living, of autonomy. But these communities were impacted by an enormous amount of violence as a result of European settlers who were exploring the Caribbean. This is really what sets the stage for the expansion and growth of colonialism and the later expansion and growth of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery more broadly across the world. The 1600s are a really important time in the history of both Britain and the Caribbean. This is an era when the transatlantic slave trade is growing. This is an era in which enslaved Africans are being shipped to parts of the Caribbean and parts of the larger Atlantic world in greater and greater number. There are new pieces of legislation being enacted that create the forms of basis of the societies in which enslaved people and slave owners live in. The 1661 Barbados Slave Code dictates the rights and responsibilities that slaveholders have and that enslaved people have. It's a really important piece of legislation that actually fortifies this racial, class, and imperial order. In this slave code, enslaved Africans are described as brutes. They are stripped of their legal rights and are unable to defend themselves. At the same time that the Barbados Slave Code is passed, a Servant Act is passed. Most servants would have been indentured labourers, they would have been usually white servants, and this servant code gives them rights, at the same time strips away the rights of enslaved Africans. This slave code is then sort of replicated in other parts of the Atlantic world and becomes a really important way in which this racial caste order is enshrined into law. And as it's enshrined into law, it enshrines violence as the basis of the society in which enslaved people and slaveholders will live. And this violence continues beyond the period of racial slavery. It's in the Caribbean where we see the development of both slavery and capitalism. The transatlantic slave trade is at its heart a capitalist-based system, and that transatlantic slave trade produced an enormous amount of wealth for European imperial countries, Britain especially. That wealth was then transferred in various ways to British individuals, British institutions, and that's what helps fuel and helps shape the industrial changes that are taking place in Britain at the same time that slavery is also occurring. The history of the abolition of slavery is often told as one that's quite self-congratulatory of Britain. But it's really important to remember the agency of enslaved people. So in 1816, there was a rebellion in Barbados. In 1823, there was a rebellion in British Guyana. And in 1831, there were rebellions in Jamaica. And these three rebellions had a really important role in changing the direction of abolition in the early 1800s in Britain. In the wake of the end of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery, racism actually increased. It became far more hardened in the 19th century and really became far more seeped into state policy, into economic policy. And the Caribbean and people in the Caribbean had very different ideas about what freedom looked like for them versus what the colonial state wanted for them or what former white planters wanted for them. For the enslaved, freedom looks like being able to have their own land, being able to cultivate their land, being able to work at certain times at their preference. But the colonial state had a much more rigid view about what freedom would look like. And what's important is that as formerly enslaved people are trying to kind of eke out their independence, they're being thwarted by a variety of policies that are enacted by the colonial governments that continue to limit their ability to actually be able to have autonomy over their own lives. What lingered long after the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery was anti-Black racism. And in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries, anti-Black racism has increased. In Britain, it manifested itself in a colour bar that impacted the lives of not just African Caribbean people, but people of colour more broadly, many of whom worked in Britain, lived in Britain, formed families in Britain during the 19th and 20th centuries. And this really impacted their ability to gain housing, it impacted employment, it impacted their relationship with the state, their relationship with white Britons as well. It impacted so many features and facets of their lives. In the interwar period, there was a rise of African Caribbean middle-class writers, students, activists coming to Britain, and their experiences of anti-Black racism oftentimes led to them being really interested in ways to challenge anti-Black racism. Many of them created some of the first civil rights organisations in Britain. One example being Dr. Harold Moody, who was born in Jamaica and who established in 1931 an organisation called the League of Coloured Peoples. The League of Coloured Peoples became a really influential anti-racist organisation in the interwar period and in the 1940s as well, that tried to give a voice to people of colour who had ties to the British Empire, not just from the Caribbean, but those from West Africa, those from South Asia as well. And the LCP also created alliances with other activists who were living in Britain at the time in order to really challenge what they saw as the discriminatory aspects of the colour bar. Many in the LCP saw themselves just as equal as white British subjects, which legally they were, but unfortunately they were not given the same opportunities. The 1930s was a really difficult time for the poor and the working class in the Caribbean, given the economic context of the Great Depression and the general ways in which, by the 20th century, the Caribbean, which had long been sort of central to Britain's wealth as a result of slavery, had become economically stagnant. Many of the workers were living on the breadline, and the Caribbean no longer held its kind of lucrative identity within the British Empire. The post-war period sees an enormous rise in Caribbean migration and movement to Britain. This is shaped by economic factors. This is shaped by the kind of post-war restructuring of Britain and the need that Britain had at that time for more workers. And so as a result of changes in immigration legislation, this is what sort of encourages Caribbean and other colonial citizens to come to Britain and to try and find work. Now, when they do, many experience anti-Black racism, they face the colour bar, but they also face a really intense form of kind of state racism, where the state As a result of fears about the changing demographics of Britain, the ways in which there were anxieties about Britain not always remaining principally a white nation, and how migration and movement was changing the country into a kind of much more multiracial country. And that also feeds into the larger forms of violent anti-Black racism that occurs from 1945. So there are riots, there's murders taking place that really aren't dealt with sufficiently by the government or by police authorities. And instead, what happens is that this increase in racism in the post-war period is blamed on people of colour in the main. They are seen to be the ones who have brought this problem of racism to Britain, when in fact this problem of racism in Britain has always existed, and is not principally down to the rise of migration in the post-war period. But again, what you do see in response to this rise of anti-Black racism is persistent, consistent attempts to challenge racism. And this leads to a flourishing of new anti-racist organisations. It leads to a flourishing of the Black Power movement, which is a radical movement trying to challenge and undermine anti-Black racism, as well as other forms of class-based discrimination. And what's fascinating in the 1960s, when Black Power activists are really prominent in Britain, is that there's also Black Power activism occurring in the Caribbean. In post-war Britain, one of the most sort of influential activists is a woman named Claudia Jones. She's born in Trinidad, she moves to the United States, she's later deported from the US because of her radical politics, and she ends up in Britain, and she helps to establish one of the most important newspapers, the West Indian Gazette, that becomes a really critical space for challenging racism, for challenging ongoing oppressions. Claudia Jones creates coalitions with so many other activists across the country to challenge discriminatory legislation that's being passed by the British government, and also to create alliances with people beyond the Caribbean to really try to strengthen activism, so to include people from West Africa, to include coalitions of people from South Asia, as part of this larger challenge to this racial and class and imperial order that has been long shaping Britain and the larger British Empire. The Windrush scandal really has its origins in immigration policies and changes that took place in late 20th century Britain. Many of the Caribbean people, some of whom were children at the time, who came to Britain didn't have documentation to show, didn't have passports for instance, had lost those documents, but also the Home Office had lost documents. What the Windrush scandal shows is the long investment that the British state has had in trying to exclude people of colour, in particular to exclude people of colour from the Caribbean, many of whom see themselves as wanting to belong to the mother country, as wanting to have the same rights and benefits that white Britons have. And it really is one of the most sort of explicit examples of the ways in which the colour bar had seeped into British political and in particular immigration legislation. And so the scandal is not over, it continues. Even though there's been calls for compensation, there's been calls for reform of the Home Office and immigration policies, this hasn't undone so much of the damage that has actually been caused to individuals and to families and to communities across this country. In recent years, there's been a huge amount of debate about reparations. Reparations have been called for by Caribbean states themselves. Reparations has been called for by a variety of different groups. And reparations aren't just demanded for the legacies of slavery, but also much more broadly, colonialism and the ways in which the colonial project and the British Empire impoverished the Anglophone Caribbean, impoverished many parts of the world. In so much of these debates about reparations, I think there's been a lot of focus on money and how much and who would pay. But more broadly, I think reparations and discussions about reparations are really vital because they are one of the ways in which this legacy, this living history of this racial, class and imperial order is being, or is attempting to be, redressed. This larger history about the entangled relationship between Britain and the Anglophone Caribbean forms a really important part of my research that is explored further in my book, Empire Without End, A New History of Britain and the Caribbean.